Great. Okay. Great. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Raymond Ehlers. Raymond is an experimental physicist investigating QCD matter under extreme conditions, characterizing properties of the quark, gluon plasma through measurements of jets and their substructure, as well as their rigorous comparison to theoretical calculations. After receiving his BA in physics from Columbia University, he earned a PhD at Yale University, focusing on measurements of jet quenching in the quark-gluon plasma as part of the ELISE collaboration. During his postdoctoral career with Oak Ridge and Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, he has expanded his portfolio to include statistical inference methods and their application to data as a member of the Jetscape collaboration, as well as the physics of the electron-ion collider as a contributor to the ECCE proto-collaboration. He is currently a convener of the ELISE Jet and Hard Photon Physics Working Group and recently completed a 4-year term leading the Jetscape Working Group applying Bayesian inference to jet quenching measurements. Take it away, I think.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you today. Yeah, my goal for today is really to just trying to give a kind of broad introduction to the topics that I'll cover in some more detail next week. Yeah, particularly given our group here, please feel free to interrupt me. Let's have a discussion through this seminar. I prepared probably too much material, so we'll see what we get through, but I think we'll be able to cover everything and still have some time for discussion. So so I have this title here talking about trying to probe structure of QCD matter. But it's a little bit of a mouthful, so I wanted to break down a little bit what we'd like to try and focus on. So first, I'll start with a quick introduction on QCD, just to make sure we have a kind of shared baseline in terms of what we're discussing. Then I want to move to QCD matter and how we create this through heavy-ion collisions. And then, which I understand you also had a nice presentation from Soren about a month ago. So I will try and focus on maybe a somewhat different perspective, namely coming as an experimentalist. What I've found over recent years is that, really trying to have a dialogue between experimentalists and theorists and making sure that we can speak in a similar way, that we can understand each other well, is really quite beneficial in terms of how we address problems. So I'll talk more about that maybe next week with Bayesian inference, but nonetheless, I think this can really be quite valuable. And then I'll talk some about jet quenching and how we can actually try and probe this QCD matter. So okay, just to make sure we're starting off from the same page here. We're talking about the strong nuclear force and quantum chromodynamics, right? So the idea here, right, is that QCD is our field theory of the strong nuclear force. And what we mean when we're talking about this is really trying to get to the heart of matter and our understanding here, right? So we're looking inside of our protons and neutrons that are inside of our nucleus or our atom, and looking at really the constituent particles of these nucleons, right? So we have this quite complicated structure inside. That's there it goes. Right, that are these protons and neutrons that are made up of these quarks and gluons, where we have this description codified together in our standard model. So we'll particularly focus on these quarks as our constituent particles and these gluons as our force carriers of quantum chromodynamics, collectively referred to as partons. Now, in terms of the theory, right, quarks and gluons carry some set of what are known as color charges, with multiple color charges here assigned in our theory. From a theory perspective, we talk about this as non-abelian SU3 gauge theory. I have a description of our QC Lagrangian here. Now, as an experimentalist, I'm not going to go through this term by term, but what I want to do is particularly highlight one of these terms, namely this term here, which is indicating that we have we have, because our gluons are force carriers, carry color charge, this means that they're self-interacting. And as a consequence of them carrying this charge, this really is what gives rise to the complexities of QCD structure. So I write down some of these fundamental interactions of QCD on the lower right here. You can see basically, right, particularly these two vertices involving all gluons is really, yeah, we'll see the consequences of these interactions. Now, just as a reminder to contrast with QED, right? So electrodynamics, right? We have just one charge there, and our photon, our force carrier, is non-self-interacting, right? And so by adding this kind of additional self-interaction, this is really what derives a substantial complexity, the consequences of which we'll be talking about the next couple of weeks. Okay, so we have this kind of baseline theory. I've shown you some Lagrangian. We can, in principle, try and kind of work out all our dynamics from this. Now, again, I'm going to try and give this from a kind of an experimental perspective. And so what I want to point out is as a general kind of framework, how we want to think about how we actually can probe these interactions. So we'll just take some Feynman diagram on the right. For example, I show interactions. We really just want to talk about interactions between fundamental particles. In the case on the right, we have our QED interaction. We have our electrons interacting with photon, but you can write out the same interaction, for example, with our quarks and gluons. And the bottom line here that I want to highlight is just this concept of if we have these fundamental interactions, we can characterize how strong they are by this momentum transfer scale q squared, right? And this, right, we can link then to some sort of characteristic scale in which we're probing our interaction, right? So if I have a low momentum transfer interaction, I'm going to be probing short distance scales, whereas if I have a large q squared, sorry, maybe I said that backwards. In any case, the point is, right, small q squared is going to be large distances, and large q squared is going to be small distances, right? So higher momentum transfer lets me probe smaller, the dynamics of smaller scales. And so as a consequence of this, from quantum mechanics, we know then that basically virtual pairs will screen these interactions. So I'll have some impact on this, which is to say in a different way that how our interaction couples depends on the momentum transfer which we're looking at, right? So my coupling, my alpha parameter depends on the scale at which I'm probing it. So again, if we're going to go back to QED for a moment, something a little bit more familiar, right? We know that if we look at, for example, a small q squared interaction, as we've seen, this is larger distance. And in the case of QED, we see that going to small q squared gives us weaker coupling. And so this should be at least somewhat familiar in the concept of for example, thinking of dielectric materials. So, as I go further away, my charge appears weaker. And right, so we have this kind of basic conception. Hopefully this matches with your intuition, but then we should think about this in terms of what happens with QCD, because it's, yeah, we see quite a bit of different experience. So here, what I have here is a plot of the strength of the strong coupling as a function of this momentum transfer q squared. And what we see here, right, and this is kind of the world's data from a few years ago, quite a strong experimental program over yeah, multiple orders of magnitude. And what we see here are kind of two distinct regions, namely at this low q squared region. This is kind of where we live, okay, even further up the scale, but broadly kind of in this left-hand region is where we see this phenomenon known as confinement. So our coupling's getting stronger and stronger, and our partons are confined inside of our color neutral hadron objects, or hadrons, right? These hadrons are kind of the particles that we observe in our detectors, for example. We'll talk about this later, but generally dominates kind of this left-hand side. So I have this very strong coupling in this region. But if I go to higher q squared here, what I'm doing is my interactions between, for example, two partons, my two quarks, for example, starts to look Coulomb-like. So my interactions are weakening as I go to this increasing momentum scale. And this really gives us this opportunity to explore the so-called asymptotic freedom region, where the coupling gets so weak that we break out of the confinement region and start to be able to observe more directly the consequences of these interacting partons. So to say just a few words in terms of kind of how we think about this theoretically and how we can calculate this. So on in our confinement region, these interactions are highly nonlinear, which is to say differently, these are not something we can calculate in a straightforward manner with perturbative QCD, but instead this is where we use our non-perturbative methods or lattice QCD, various approaches to be able to calculate in a region where you have high coupling. However, when we go to this high Q squared region, perturbative calculations become tractable, our couplings become small enough, and things become substantially simpler. So in fact, by going to this high Q squared region, you'll see, of course, experimentally, this takes, let's say, quite some effort. But in doing so, we're actually moving to a region where it's much more tractable to try and address these problems. Okay, so that was a whirlwind of QCD, but puts us on the same page in terms of kind of basics here. So now let's take the next step and try and add some complexity around what happens when I have many interactions between our particles. So another way to say this is we really want to try and think about many-body dynamics. And so I would say general principle of physics, if we have kind of many particles, right, we expect to observe some sort of complex emergent behavior, which is to say we expect to see interactions that are not derivable, or we expect to see consequences that are not derivable from elementary interactions. So to start with maybe a more familiar example, we can think, for example, about our phase diagram of water, which is shown here on the left, right, where I can either change my pressure and my temperature in the system and move through my different phases of water, ice, water vapor, right? All of this, it should be familiar with our, in our region, for example, of everyday experience, right? So we intuitively kind of understand how moving around this diagram can affects our movements in our thermodynamic qualities affect kind of how we experience this. Now, of course, there's much more complexity here. I show a simple example, but the point is these electromagnetic interactions give rise to these much more complex dynamics. So we can try and look at the same exercise, except in the case of quantum chromodynamics, QCD. And here we see quite a bit more complicated picture. Let's say something that we're still trying to understand both theoretically and experimentally. So again, we have the same concept, approximately where we're changing, for example, the temperature and something we think of like a pressure here. And if we heat this region up, if we inject enough energy, we can move from kind of our standard nuclear matter phase up into this so-called quark gluon plasma, where our hadrons melt into these partonic degrees of freedom. We'll see what that means in a moment. And our colliders give us access to try and move through this phase space. So there's a lot of information encoded there. One way we can think about this is in terms of lattice QCD. So I show just one calculation here on the extreme left of the diagram. So this barochemical potential of 0. And if we think back to our thermodynamics, I'm going to plot a quantity here, this energy density normalized appropriately by the temperature, such that it's proportional to the degrees of freedom in our system. And in doing so, we see this quite striking behavior where there is this predicted phase transition around 155 MeV, where we move from kind of over here on going off to the left side of my plot, transitioning to the right, moving from this confined to deconfined state. Or stated differently, I'm moving from my hadronic degrees of freedom down here, right? So my bound particles that are color neutral into my partonic degrees of freedom. So you see this rapid rise exactly around this phase transition predicted here. Now, if we then turn our attention to this high temperature region, what we see here is that although we're starting to approach this Stefan-Boltzmann limit, right, of non-interacting particles, we see that even in this high temperature regime, there is still some kind of residual difference between our expectations for this QCD matter and this non-interaction. What this is really telling us is that this difference right here is telling us there's some complex encoding of, for example, bound states of quarks and gluons that, this exact complexity is in fact kind of exactly what we want to study in this high temperature QCD that we'll be talking about here. So this difference is really indicating that there's interesting physics. So okay, we have kind of a broad kind of conception of this. So how do we actually go about kind of accessing this? So now I'm going to take a little bit of a turn towards a more experimental perspective. And I can try and map kind of observable dynamics into this phase diagram. So in the first case, right, we can think about this in terms of the early universe, namely right after the Big Bang, right? I'm going to evolve from a very high temperature state where my constituent particles are basically my partons, my quarks and gluons. And this corresponds to this left side of our phase diagram. And then as the universe cools, we then evolve to kind of more standard nuclear matter. So this state then, about a microsecond after the Big Bang, corresponds to this deconfined QCD matter, right, which we'll call our quark gluon plasma. Now, this is, of course, only one shot to make these observations, but we want to be able to recreate this in the lab. And how we actually go about doing this are these so-called heavy ion collisions. So accelerating our nuclei to near the speed of light and having them collide together, depositing energy density in a very small region. So here I show you kind of a stages of a collision, stepping through with increasing time on the right, talking over an extraordinarily short time scale of something like 10 to the minus 22 seconds. But through this evolution here, we're going to access some region, again, on the order of kind of 150 MeV, which is really maybe the highest temperature that we can access in the lab, really. QCD, or excuse me, the QGP tends to be a material of extremes. So to say just a little bit more about kind of how this collision evolves. So on the left here, we have our two nuclei coming in. So coming in from the right and the left, colliding together, Lorentz contracted to basically be pancakes. They will interact kind of with some initial set of interactions. And as these you have a large number of kind of relatively low momentum interactions, you then deposit this energy carried by the nuclei, forming this quark gluon plasma, which then evolves over time, generally kind of treated with some sort of hydrodynamic evolution, as well as potentially the response of the medium to external probes, evolving and cooling, eventually leading to the production of particles, so transitioning back from these protonic degrees of freedom to the hadronic ones that we'll actually eventually observe in our detector. So, okay, I've talked about this in an abstract sense, but as I said, I'm an experimentalist, so I want to say at least a little bit about how we actually create the QGP and how we actually go about detecting it. So there are two facilities in the world where we're actually able to do these experiments. One is the Relativistic Heavy-Ion Collider at Brookhaven, and nearing really the end of its life here after a successful 25-year campaign. as well as at the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. So these two facilities really act quite in a complementary manner, giving us kind of at least multiple points in which we can actually try and anchor our understanding of the medium, and has been quite a, yeah, I think quite a successful experimental approach here. So we've been, yeah, quite fortunate to be able to have multiple facilities to do this. So in terms of how we actually go about doing this, so of course I need my accelerator, but I also need my experiments. And I will focus in on the Large Hadron Collider, although we could have very similar discussions at RHIC. And so we have these 4 large experiments of the LHC, right? Both at the 3, let's say, oriented more towards particle physics, ATLAS, CMS, and LHCb, and then we have ELISE oriented towards heavy ions. Although all 4 experiments have made quite substantial contributions. So yeah, this is of course looking from high above, but it's quite remarkable. I would say I work on ELISE, and the detector, you're really just driving through a French town. You drive along a creek. Suddenly you turn to the right, and there's a large industrial facility, and you go. You could go underground to then see ELISE. All of this is, yeah, to be very clear, about 100 meters underground in the Geneva area. So okay, so we have these kind of large experimental facilities, these large experiments, but let me say a little bit more about them. But before I get there, I will highlight as recent news, all 4 the LHC experiments were yeah, honored to receive this breakthrough prize for fundamental physics breakthrough prize for kind of the measurements that we've done as part of Run 2, so from 2015 and on, and as a 1/4 of 1,829th of a prize winner. Let me tell you, it's quite a quite an honor. No, I mean it is all, sorry. It actually, of course, it very much is. It's, I think, the fact that we have so many winners here is just to indicate that these are really large collaborative efforts, and that's really the only way that this team science approach is really the only way that we would be able to really access any of this physics. So so just to highlight one experiment in particular, here we're looking at CMS, compact muon solenoid, and there it's fairly representative in terms of kind of the detectors that we'll see at the Large Hadron Collider. So in general, you have kind of your beam coming in and out of the page, colliding in the center of our detector here, and we have you'll have basically some sort of kind of precision tracking. Often this is some sort of silicon tracking to let you detect your particles quite precisely and exactly where the particle is created. And then you'll have some sort of calorimetry outside of that, measuring energy deposits, and then for some experiments you'll have then additional detectors out here. So in general, this kind of cylindrical shape is quite characteristic, and yeah, we'll talk about how you measure these particles in just a moment. Now, I will highlight in particular in terms of the scale. This is yeah, a person to kind of set the size, and you'll note that it does say compact in the name of this, and in fact, it is quite compact in terms of LHC detectors. So what this is really, what you should keep in mind is that really these are, as I've said, quite large experiments in terms of collaboration size, right? The number of people involved, but also in terms of kind of the physical construction. So that, yeah, CMS is maybe about half the size of something like ELISE or ATLAS. So okay, just to say a bit more then about how we actually go about detecting these particles. I've basically taken a slice from the previous slide, and now we have a cross section looking in kind of from the beam direction of the different detectors. And what I really want to highlight here is we can see these different kind of species of detectors that of particles that are propagating through our detector. So our interaction point is about here on the left. And the thing you should keep in mind is that the reason why we have all these kind of different pieces, we have our silicon tracking, we have our calorimetry, and then we have, for example, our muon chambers, is that this is the approach that lets us really detect all the various types of particles that are produced in these collisions. So, for example, if I have my incoming nuclei, they collide together, right? I'll produce many particles, and depending on what they are. So, for example, if it's an electron, it's going to be we have an electric field which will cause it to bend as it propagates, and since it's, for example, an electron, it will interact with our silicon tracking and deposit a signal, and then it will hit this electromagnetic calorimeter, which is basically a dense material that we've interspersed electronics with to, for example, pick up scintillation light from the particles interacting. And this is what allows us to actually see and measure those electrons. So basically we can see, for example, in this case, right, we can see the path from the silicon, and then we can get a sense of the energy from how much energy is deposited into our calorimetry. Now, because particles interact in different ways, right? For example, my charged hadron, again, will bend in my electric field or in my magnetic field. We'll have some interactions both in my silicon as well as perhaps in my electromagnetic calorimetry, but really to actually stop the particle and again get a sense of measure its energy, I need substantially more density, which is what we do in these hadronic calorimeters. So we use different materials to try and put enough physical material in front of that particle to interact with and actually deposit its energy. So the bottom line is that we are able to measure a substantial amount of information about these particles, but we tend not to have, let's say, particular identification information about whether it's an electron or what type of charged hadron it is. And only by kind of combining all of this information in appropriate ways, really taking advantage of kind of you can think of multi-dimensional approaches or multiple sources. Only by putting all these pieces together are we actually able to kind of reconstruct a picture that gives insight to detailed insight, let's say, into what actually happens in those collisions. So, okay, so what does this look like in practice? If I've built my detector, I've developed my algorithms to actually kind of try and reconstruct my collisions. What does it look like? So here we have a event display from Elise of proton-proton collisions at 5 TeV. And so out of this, we can see we have kind of some small interaction point. Elise is built slightly differently than the other detectors, but namely focused around the so-called time projection chamber, which is basically a large gaseous volume where we'll kind of get more continuous measurements of charged particles than you would just get from, say, silicon. And by doing this, we can run our reconstruction algorithms. We can use the constraints of our kinematics to actually go from just measurements at some point in my detector and reconstruct back what's happened in this collision. So each of these, for example, the colors here should be proportional to the momentum that we measure them at. You can see some particles kind of in this central region, so transverse to where our collision is, and then okay, we also, in this case, for example, measure muon. In this case, Elise has instrumented to measure muons in this kind of forward direction. So we have this diagram on the right. I've flipped it around. We can kind of we can line these two up. So right in this proton-proton case, this is fairly straightforward. There's of course substantial experimental work to even get to this point, but this is fairly tractable, and because of the kind of tractability of this, we're able to measure in quite some detailed ways and reconstruct not just kind of the bulk details, but really detailed correlations in these collisions, and for example, details about the types of quarks that are produced, heavy flavor quarks, these kind of questions, in a way that's kind of well controlled. And of course, in the case of, for example, Atlas or CMS, we of course have had these extremely detailed studies of the Higgs and many details of QCD. But of course, okay, that's not my focus for today. Instead, what I want to turn my attention to is what happens when we collide lead nuclei. So you have to, this is a Elise event display on the right from lead-lead collisions at, approximately the same energy. And you need to do an internal flip in your mind. So this is the same central barrel, whereas now the muon chambers have moved to the right side of our figure. But what I really want you to highlight here is the substantial difference in the number of particles in the event activity that I observe in my detector on the right, where each of these white lines are different particles, and then we see deposits of energy, for example, in our calorimetry here in the red. So I've now gone from tens of particles to thousands of particles per collision, and I want to do the same kind of exercise. I want to try and reconstruct each of these particles and understand their underlying kinematics. But now my experimental problem has gotten substantially more complicated. So this is what we're trying to wrestle with as experimentalists. However, I want to make one more point here that in fact it's even more complicated than that. So what I show you here is if I focus just on the particles in this time projection chamber, we can talk about this more later, but it's as I said, it's just a gaseous detector where the signal basically of each of these interactions will float down in some external electric field down to my end caps here to actually be measured. Right, these collisions are happening many times a second. In lead-lead, we're, for example, colliding at 50 kilohertz. So I don't just get this single experimentally. I don't just get this single measure, but in fact, if I integrate over, this is about 100 milliseconds, I actually am getting many collisions, all overlapping in my detector volume. And I'm going to end up, I read this signal out as fast as I can, but you're still going to end up having overlap. So each color here now corresponds to different vertices, different interaction points that we've reconstructed as you have more and more collisions. And so we have all these overlapping signals sitting in our that we measure in our detectors, and we have to try and reconstruct this and make sense of it. So we've really given ourselves a difficult task. But if we're successful in doing this, in which we have been in recent years, this means this high level of statistics means that we can really investigate not only our properties, our kind of bulk properties of our quark-gluon plasma, but also measure rare probes as well, which is what we'll get to focus on. So okay, I've given you my experimental piece, and we can go back to this question then, thinking about, for example, this lattice calculation where we see this transition, and we can ask quite reasonably, can we actually observe the consequences of all these transitions, this complex many-body behavior? Can we see this experimentally? And so I will say just a few brief answers to this. I will leave generally most of the kind of discussion about the bulk medium to there's a very nice seminar from Soren last month who covered kind of these bulk properties very well. So I will, as I said, I'll leave that mostly to him, but I do want to highlight just a few observable consequences, and then I will focus in on how we can kind of probe the microscopic structure. So in terms of kind of our signals of how do we actually know that we've measured the QGP, right? I showed you we have all these particles. How do we actually make sense of this in a way that indicates, what we've measured? So I would say, one of the very clear signals of the quark-gluon plasmas is what we describe as collective expansion. And so the concept here is, if I look, for example, at the left, I have my beams of my nuclei going into and out of the page. And experimentally, we don't have control of how well they actually overlap with each other when they collide. We steer our beams into each other, and there's going to be some range of interactions with the most, if they fully overlap. We describe these as our most central collisions. But more frequently, what we're going to see is some kind of partial overlap. And as they go by, you're going to end up with this ellipsoidal shape. So this is a spatial anisotropy where you have differences in your pressure gradients. You're going to be pushing harder. You're going to have a bigger difference in kind of your gradient of your energy density in your impact parameter plane versus going out. And as a consequence of this initial spatial anisotropy, if I then measure the momentum distribution of my particles, so just counting how many there is with respect to this interaction plane, I'm going to see a stronger kick in plane than going out perpendicular to this. And so if I write a way to kind of visualize this, we can look at the right and see this. If I start right where the colors are again proportional to energy density, and we see this spatial anisotropy, we see exactly this kind of kick of stronger expansion in the direction of the stronger gradients. So this is very nice in terms of visualization, but it actually turns out that this what's shown on the right here is not from heavy ion collisions, but actually the same sort of collective dynamics observed in this case, in ultra cold lithium atoms. So there are actually some nice physical connections between kind of this behavior that we observe in heavy ion collisions and what we see, in these ultra cold atoms. Now, I will gloss over kind of how this is done, but we can then take those measurements and some other measurements of kind of our bulk properties and try and use these to actually extract properties of our quark-gluon plasma, right? So I can say, for example, it's flowing in this way that I'm describing as characteristic, but how can we actually translate that back into physics? And one way we can do that is by talking about this so-called specific shear viscosity, 8 over S, where kind of our intuition here is that small 8 over S is something that flows easily as it flows past each other in a medium, and large is going to resist flow, right? And so on the right here, I have a plot of 8 over S kind of normalized so that different quantities can be comparable on our x-axis, and we can compare something like water, which as an everyday material flows quite well. We can also look at something like liquid helium, flows quite a bit better, but we actually see quite a substantial gap, nearly an order of magnitude here between, for example, helium and our extracted values of our quark-gluon plasma from measurements of kind of these bulk properties. So this is often described as kind of the most perfect fluid allowed in nature. So it's near this so-called limit from EDS-CFT that indicates basically that our quark-gluon plasma really is behaving quite a bit differently than again, quite an extreme way compared to most other matter that we can see. But this is really indicating that we have this opportunity to explore this rather different phase of QCD matter. So now, in terms of kind of how we can think about these properties, I'm gonna stop here in terms of kind of my discussion of the bulk. Again, I will refer you to, for example, Soren's talk as well as some other materials here, because I want to turn my attention then to we now have this conception of our QCD matter, and I'd like to think about how we can actually probe the details of this matter. So, so far we've talked about kind of our bulk picture, right? Again, if I count all the particles that are produced in my collision here, for example, on the right, right, I can get a conception of kind of what's happened over my many low momentum interactions. But say I'd like to really see something about that partonic structure of my medium. I want to try and probe the details of it, right? And the way that we're going to go about doing this is maybe by analogy to, for example, trying to look for the internal structure of people, right, through something like a CT scan, right, where we use computed tomography. So the idea here is that if I want to be able to look inside a person without, without physically probing, right, one way I can go about doing this is by using some source of radiation, an X-ray source, in a systematic way, and you shine this beam at a person. You then detect the particles. And after kind of a significant computational exercise to reconstruct how did my source end up, how did my X-ray source interact with my patient, I can then end up with these really quite detailed diagrams of quite detailed measurements of, for example, okay, on the right we have some scan of the brain. So we're going to try and use exactly that type of concept, except we want to do this in our particle collisions, where we're forming the quark-gluon plasma for kind of 10 to the minus 23 seconds. So if you can think back to what we talked about, almost at the beginning, we're probing this cupping as a function of q squared, right? In this asymptotic freedom, I was talking about the interactions getting simpler, right? And in fact, these interactions, as I go to higher and higher momentum, become quite simple. Namely, we form this thing called jets. So I have my partons coming in, my quarks and gluon, my quark is a pair of quarks, for example, and I'll have something that looks like 2-to-2 scattering, and I can measure the remnants of this to provide some sort of calibrated, well understood probe. And this is what we're going to try and do as a replacement of our X-ray source. Now, I haven't talked about jets yet, so let's say just a little bit about them. And we can think about this in terms of kind of just a simple diagram. So the concept here, again, is, for example, I'll have my beam of protons coming in from the left and right, which will simplify to just thinking about it as an individual set of quarks. And in this very simplified picture, they're going to come together, interact, again, in this 2-to-2 scattering approach, and we'll get some outgoing quarks transverse, if we have high enough momentum transfer, that we will detect. Let's say we're going to characterize in terms of the momentum transverse to our interaction. So these are these kind of high q squared, high momentum transfer events that we might be interested in. But this picture right here is a little bit too simple, so we're going to add some complexity as we go through. So first of all, these incoming quarks, for example, may have some what we call initial state radiation. So I may have some interactions between, they may radiate off some energy before they interact. I also am going to have potentially some final state radiation. So some after my 2-to-2 scattering, I may also have some additional kind of radiation, which is going to change the kinematics that I observe. And then in fact, I'm going to expect, just due to kind of standard QCD processes, as I'm going to kind of radiate this virtuality, this off mass shellness, and I'm going to create more and more particles as my quarks and gluons kind of propagate even through my vacuum. And if we kind of put this all together, we describe these processes as parton showers, which we describe using kind of perturbative techniques. So I'm going to be able to describe my interactions with my partons as they evolve, and then eventually these showers will then transition from my partonic to my hadronic degrees of freedom in a process we describe as we call hadronization. Right, this is this confinement process, which, as we've already described, is kind of inherently non-perturbative, but I will end up eventually right, creating these kind of color neutral hadrons shown here in purple that we will then detect in our detectors. But this is not the only source, even in just proton-proton collisions, but I also may have, for example, other interactions um, either from this kind of initial hard scattering, some multi-parton interactions, but also I could have just other interactions at the same time. My beam is not just a single particle, but it's many. And so I also can have kind of contributions from my underlying event. And so already in this just proton-proton level picture, these jets do provide us with some sort of calibrated probe if that we're able to reconstruct, but we still have to deal with kind of a broad set of complications here. So how we actually find this experimentally, I need to develop some technique to be able to find these jets. And if I can do that, for example, this black cone here, if I can find a way to kind of isolate the effects that I'm interested in, this then can give us a connection between our partonic level interaction here and our hadronic level that we're for example measuring. And so, right, so yeah, to say it very explicitly then, jets provide us kind of an approach to try and measure, connect our measurable hadrons to our unmeasurable partons. Right, the question is, how can we actually go about doing this experimentally? Or okay, equally theoretically. So to say just a little bit about how we actually, right, how do we find these jets that I've said, these collimated sprays of particles? So I'm going to take another one of these event displays here, and what I'm going to do is we tend to show these projections. It's easier to visualize and think about, but we want to actually take advantage of kind of the full 3D space that we measure. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to unroll this this kind of cylindrical detector into into kind of two angular spaces. So we have eta, our pseudo-rapidity, and phi, which is our azimuth angle going around a detector. And if I do that for this event, for example, I could see kind of two very clear jets. But how can I do this kind of in a self-consistent, standardized way? Well, we take advantage of what are known as jet clustering algorithms. And this is basically, you can think of kind of as a unsupervised clustering algorithm to try and to use some metric to combine my particles together. So this exercise is kind of fairly straightforward in this picture. We can talk about this, or you can ask me some questions about this, and we can discuss kind of how this works at a algorithmic level. But the concept that you really want to think about here is just, I'm going to search for these kind of high momentum particles, and I'm going to try and do this in a systematic way to be able to make these connections at the kind of measured level. So okay, so we have these tools in place. We've talked about these in proton-proton collisions. So now basically what we're going to try and do is embed this into my heavy-ion collision. And here we're quite fortunate in the sense of because I have many partons available in my collision, my heavy-ion collision, in rare cases, they will actually scatter with this very high momentum transfer criteria we've talked about. So in fact, we have kind of a self-generated probe of the quark-gluon plasma just by virtue of having collided our heavy ions together. Now, so in principle, that concept is really quite fortunate because given the timescales involved, there really is no mechanism by which we could, for example, probe this externally, right? If you tried to, the timescales in which we're able to experimentally control, let's say, lasers, is substantially longer than this. Not to mention that the scale we're talking about is on the order of tens of Fermi, which is not something that we can really probe externally. So we're quite fortunate in the sense then that these jets provide us the opportunity to actually probe this this medium in a calibrated way, just by virtue of how these collisions are or how these nuclei collide. So okay, so we have this concept. We want to try and kind of embed these nuclei or these jets into our interactions. But how does this actually work? So I'm going to switch to this kind of cartoon on the right here, where we've had our nuclei collide. They've interacted. and we're seeing kind of a later time picture where our medium is formed, and we've had our high momentum transfer. We've had our incoming quarks also have a hard scatter. So what happens is you have these partons interact. They're produced very early in our collision, and they're going to propagate through our medium and interact. And so collectively, these interactions between my parton and the medium, the observable consequences, the consequences of this, we generally refer to as jet quenching. So in terms of what we see here, right, we have our parton propagating through our medium, and we're going to have both our expected vacuum processes, so these radiations that we talked about before, just in proton-proton, but then also we're going to have a additional effect from our medium-induced interactions. Yeah. So in particular, right, the reason why we're most excited, or why I'm most excited about these jets, is inherently these are going to be high momentum transfer processes, which, as we talked about at the very beginning, is something that will let us resolve short distance scales. So instead of seeing this kind of quark-gluon plasma as some kind of blob of QCD matter, it actually gives us an approach to probe what the microscopic structure looks like. We can ask things like, we can start to ask questions about the details of those interactions. So in terms then of kind of what this looks like in terms of our physics picture, can be useful to kind of try to isolate different effects. And we can think about this both from the perspective of the parton as well as the quark-gluon plasma. So we can ask this question: what does our parton, as it's propagating through the medium, actually resolve? For example, can we see this microscopic structure, the QGP? This is something that I'll focus on next week. Can I see some sort of collective excitation or emergent dynamics that we're not able to observe on this kind of bulk level? We also can ask, what does the medium resolve the parton as it propagates through, right? So my interactions will look different if I have a single parton versus if it's split apart in my shower, and the medium can resolve that as separate sources. So can the medium actually resolve this scale? We can ask in terms of, in the presence of the medium, what does it actually do to the parton? So not just what the parton can resolve, but how does the parton change in the presence of this medium? So for example, you could imagine the effects of different quark flavors. So if I have a heavy quark, it can evolve in a different way as a light quark. And then we can ask the question of turning this around, right? How does the presence of a probe affect the medium? So if the medium is interacting, kind of if we model our medium as a fluid, and I have a probe going through it, can this generate some sort of response in our medium? For example, if I think of similar by analogy, a duck moving through a pond, you'll see some wake that's associated with in the direction of the propagation of the duck. Can I actually see, for example, the effects of this wake? And so this is kind of the physics that underlies what we're trying to think about as we probe with these jets. But it's not so easy to kind of map directly what happens in terms of the physics, right? As I've said, we get these kind of bulk measurements of particles. But there are a few kind of clear observable consequences of jet quenching. One is what I would describe as energy redistribution. So taking energy of my parton propagating in a particular direction and redistributing it to different angles, for example, going to large angles compared to the direction of propagation. We also will see modifications of the internal jet structure. So there are ways that I can try and understand the details of this. For example, this parton shower, and we'll see differences in medium as compared to in vacuum. And then lastly, you can also expect, right, if I, for example, had a very hard interaction between one of my medium constituents and my jet, then I can in fact deflect the entire direction of my jet or my parton. And so we can try and look for these experimental consequences in our measurements. Okay, I'm just about out of time here, so okay, maybe I will stop just about from here. But I wanted to say just one more comment here about how we actually go about finding these particles. So right, again, if I go back to my event display, I have all these particles. I'm going to unroll it again, but now I'm going to unroll it in lead-lead collisions instead, right? So I have kind of this. I should have this kind of picture in my head, right? And if I do this, right, sometimes it's very easy to kind of find my jet. I can still see a very clear signal, but these effects of the jet quenching, right, if I, for example, have propagated a lot, too much of my energy away from the direction of propagation, I may not be able to find this other jet in such a straightforward way, right? So how do we actually go about doing this? Well, we need to have a very well calibrated control, basically, of what my background is from my bulk medium, and then I need to be able to subtract my background basically in a precise way. So this is something that we've really developed quite some experimental expertise at doing. There are many different ways to go about doing it. I've developed some ways, for example, of applying machine learning techniques to try and expand the range that we're able to measure. I can talk about this more next time if this is something of interest as a general topic, either for background subtraction in general, how we deal with these things, but also in terms of this kind of innovative techniques. But the bottom line that I want you to walk away with is that even if I have this kind of clear picture, this almost this cartoon level picture in my head, be able to actually match that up to the experimental reality is has taken quite some innovation and careful efforts. Okay, so great. We've at least kind of covered all of the kind of introductory material that I had. As an experimentalist, I wanted to highlight a few experimental measurements beyond what I wanted to talk about next week. But okay, given the time, maybe I'll pause here and we can, I can take these next week as well as a kind of basis for what I'd like to discuss in terms of our physics. So I think, yeah, I will at least pause here and ask for questions.
Running questions, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I mean, I guess it probably makes sense. Maybe Daniel, you can do the questions since you're in person there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Any questions? I have one of these. Yeah. Aaron, thanks for the talk. So I just wanted to ask a pretty basic question on slide 6E.
Okay. 16. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay, so you have these particles moving through the sector and they're curving, so there's some magnetic field that's interacting with them. How are you tracking the path of each parton, for instance? Are you measuring it at many different stages, and then are you then also measuring its energy? But by measuring it at different stages, are you not going to change its energy somehow by interacting with it? I don't know if it's quite a basic goal.
Yeah. All an excellent question. So let me try and let's take kind of one of these particles as an example. Maybe let's try and focus on this charged hadron here. We can call it a pion for, I mean, we're at the LHC, we're dominated by pions, so almost certainly is. So right, so how does this actually look, right? We've kind of drawn this trajectory onto this picture, but it's right, as your question gets to, that's not actually how we observe it. So if we first start with this silicon, right? The silicon tracking, right, is basically, it's very thin strips of silicon. We put these basically like camera sensors on it. right? And as the particle goes through, it will, as you say, it will interact and deposit some energy. And so basically, if I have my particle kind of going along this track, what I'll actually see experimentally is I will see a point here, right? This is of course in 3D. So I will have, a point in this layer, in this layer, in this layer, this layer, all the way through. And I'll have that for every single particle, right? And in that interaction, as you say, it does deposit a little bit of energy. But the key there is that we build this silicon to have kind of very low, what we describe as material budget, but effectively you can think of in terms of the radiation length. So the radiation length of my particle is much longer than the material that I've put in my silicon in its way. So, okay, I don't know exactly the numbers for CMS, but in the case of Elise, for example, kind of our newest silicon has this kind of material budget of less than 1%. So in going through, in having my particle propagate through my all my silicon, it's going to deposit basically a very small amount of its energy, enough that we can pinpoint where it is, but not very much of it. And so then right, then in the case of, for example, the charged hadron, as as it continues through the detector, right, for the electromagnetic calorimeter, it's not generally dense enough for much interaction between the pions, so it's not gonna radiate very much of its energy there. And then really, when it hits this hadronic calorimeter, we are trying to kind of take the opposite approach as the silicon. Now I'm trying to put so much material budget there that basically I will absorb multiple radiation lengths of this particle, and really I want it to dump all of my energy there. And if if I've done this right, if I've designed this right, and the particle energy is right, then right, okay, if it's high enough, maybe it's not contained, but okay, generally this is not such an issue. So then I dump all my energy here, and then I have to go back and do my reconstruction. And so experimentally, right, the point is, if I take these tracks away, kind of all I actually have are, I have a point here, a point here, here, kind of for each of these interactions. And right, you can have some sort of potential ambiguities, right, if my particles cross, for example. So we have, these reconstruction algorithms for how do we actually try and figure out which points should belong to each other, and how do I match, if I get some curve of my if I assign these silicon points, how do I match those up with energy deposits in the calorimetry? So so it's quite a complicated effort, even just to kind of make a consistent picture out of the measurements we get in a single one collision. But this is where we're taking advantage of the fact that we have kind of a broad acceptance. For example, the spatial size of our cells of our sensors and our silicon can be quite small, which gives us precise pointing information. And so then you can apply all these kind of reconstruction techniques to actually put a complete picture together. But I think what I want to highlight here is just that it's quite an involved process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. I have one about the jet propagating through the medium. I think there was a nice picture for it on like slide 39.
Sure. This one?
One back.
One back. Okay, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that guy. I'm just trying to kind of think of the timeline of the actual collision. In my mind, I'm imagining you have this hard collision first, and then these two things pass through each other and create a medium. But obviously, that's not what happens. You have to have a medium first for the jet to actually propagate through. So
yeah, your question is very much on point. So so I'm actually going to go back to maybe this this diagram because yeah, indeed. So these questions of timescales are critical. So if you just do some kind of uncertainty principle type arguments, you know, for say 100 GeV jet, you know, you can get some kind of characteristic timescale of the formation time of kind of your interactions. And if you compare that to the time it takes for the quark gluon plasma to kind of form, your intuition is exactly right. My initial hard scattering will kind of take place in vacuum, right? But right, this is kind of on the order of, you know, 0.1 Fermi, something like this. And so in that time, you kind of only have kind of pre-equilibrium interactions between your nuclei, so your quark gluon plasma kind of hasn't formed at this point. And okay, I'm going to assert as an experimentalist maybe that this is not especially well understood, although maybe some of my theory colleagues will set me straight on this. But I would say in general, kind of at that point, you're not expected to have substantial interactions between your jet and kind of whatever the remnants of your nuclei are. Then, but the point is, you know, the size of this nuclei is on the order of kind of 10 Fermi, and so the time it takes for your jet then to propagate, so it's kind of formed just before your quark gluon plasma, your plasma thermalizes, and then your parton's then going to have to propagate through that medium, and while that's happening, right, your quark gluon plasma is expanding and cooling, right, and so you have quite some complicated processes going on all at once. So this to me is maybe always the irony of this approach, in that you know, based on kind of what QCD and nature has given us in QCD, this is maybe the simplest way we have of trying to access kind of these underlying partons. But just because it's maybe the simplest approach we have doesn't mean that it's straightforward, right? You still have all these different dynamics that you're trying to account for at once. So it's really, it is the question of how these dynamics kind of evolve, yeah, is quite I think quite intertwined, and yeah, kind of I think the picture that I've described is kind of a reasonable picture to keep in your mind, but let's say the exact dynamics are going to depend kind of on the precise properties of the medium and the jet, and their interplay is yeah, I think quite critical. Does that answer your question? Does that help you get a little bit better sense, or
yeah,
okay.
So it's led into another question, which is, so do you never see jets that have actually escaped pre-medium formation, or is that sometimes something that you see?
So that is I would say, so it is a open question for kind of how exactly every, let's say, jet interacts. So generally speaking, on the basis of kind of again, just kind of distance scale arguments, you of course would expect, you know, if my parton actually kind of propagates the medium, or like goes in a direction in which the medium is kind of formed, and if I've done this, say, if you know the interaction's kind of at the middle of my medium, then you kind of expect to have some sort of interactions. Now, if you're kind of early enough, or you're in particular kinematic regimes, it can kind of look more like vacuum interactions than jet interactions. There's actually, I would say, very much a kind of open question exactly how it interacts. But I don't want to maybe get too caught up in the details, because the bottom line is that right, there are, you know, again, kind of many different dynamics you could imagine, right? So imagine I take this hard scattering and I put it occurs right at the edge of my nuclei, right? One of my jets then could propagate entirely away from my quark gluon plasma, in which case it's going to look vacuum-like because it never had an opportunity to kind of interact with the QGP, right? And in that case, maybe my again, depending on my direction of propagation, maybe my other jet quenches away so much I don't find it, for example, right? So if you, yeah, maybe on the other side of the Limmy case though, if I have a jet that forms in the middle of my kind of nuclei, then it may kind of, the modifications of it may not show, you're always going to, if you have kind of interactions, you're always going to see, for example, suppression of the number of jets that I find kind of at the scales at which we're able to measure. But it may kind of, the way that it is modified may just kind of look like say a shift in kind of the shift in the spectra. Okay, sorry, I didn't quite get to this point, but basically the bottom line is that it may just lose some kind of energy out of cone, have this energy redistribution, but the jet may look kind of exactly the same as if it was in vacuum. It's just its energy has shifted. So all of that is to say, there are, kind of every maybe. Yeah, I think I can do this. Nearly any kind of configuration you can imagine, we will see kind of in some way. So in fact, it's from an experimental perspective, because we don't have kind of control of how much of my nuclei overlapping, or where is my hard scattering actually located. We have to kind of try and disentangle this after the fact. And yeah, what you'll see in some of these measurements is, in fact, kind of we do have some bias in the jets that we're able to measure are maybe not representative of kind of what every jet experiences, but rather it's representative of the jets that we're able to observe. If that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
If there's no questions from UCT, then maybe I have a question. So I'm curious what you think about, so with this sort of, once you're studying jets, you're talking about sort of embedding parton showers in the medium. I'm curious, how much of an issue do you think it is, sort of a theoretical issue, that we sort of take parton showers, which work well in vacuum and have been tested in proton-proton collisions, and sort of minimally modify them for use in heavy ion collisions? So that's sort of the first part of the question. And then I guess I'm sort of giving away that I think that's a bit of an issue. And then in light of that, what do you think of the advantages of studying jets with the added theoretical complexity, but probably with more interesting physics you can access potentially, as opposed to, say, just leading hadrons, as was done in like the early days of heavy ion physics?
Yeah. So you make a very good point. Indeed, I mean, okay, I can only give you my kind of experimental perspective on this, but my kind of my sense is that what's maybe the right way to phrase this is just to say that I also worry about kind of how we implement these modifications. I mean, it's a exceedingly difficult problem. I mean, okay, as I think you and Will maybe know better than I do. But right, it's an exceedingly difficult problem of kind of how you make these modifications and how you how you address it, right? And then not even to kind of add the discussion of if you wanted to actually create a space-time picture, right? Everything that I've kind of discussed is this momentum space picture. Even trying to kind of talk about how these evolutions really happen. In proton and in vacuum, I don't think we are so worried about this. But now that we introduce this time scale of the medium, now these kind of dynamics are actually meaningful. And so maybe I will just say, yeah, it's not clear to me that that kind of prescription that we have at the moment is absolutely the right way to go. But I think there's kind of a lot of open questions in that direction for kind of even what is the most significant kind of oversimplification that we've taken in trying to understand these. So I mean, for example, right, something I'll talk about next week is this this jet quenching parameter Q hat, right, which describes kind of how does my energy flow away from my parton. And we talk about these in terms of kind of leading order calculations. And if I go to next to leading order, the corrections aren't small, right? And so should I be, trying to take my next to leading order, kind of scattering kernel, or should I be trying to go to my next to leading order parton shower, or should I, as you say, kind of be reformulating even how I think about my parton shower in medium versus in vacuum? Yeah, I don't know if I can necessarily evaluate that question, except to say that I think it's the right question to ask.
Right.
And so, yeah, and so then your question about kind of single hadrons versus jets, right? It's, I mean, as you know, there is more complexity there, but in kind of trying to measure these jet objects. But the trade-off with that, right, is for looking at single inclusive hadrons, I think is maybe twofold. One being now you have to deal with hadronization effects, right, and fragmentation effects, which are inherently kind of non-perturbative objects. So you can try and measure these in kind of more fundamental systems, I suppose, and try and evolve them. But I think there's some kind of uncertainties with that. And not to give away too much of, maybe just as a preview for next week, right? We know that the kind of single inclusive hadrons versus jets carry somewhat different information, right? So I think there is kind of a complementary measure of the two of them. The other question I think is that, or the other thing to keep in mind is just kind of the dynamics between okay, maybe to state differently, kind of the biases that I think you'll see in kind of observed jet populations versus observed hadron populations, I think are different. And so, yeah, I mean, as you say, there are certainly more complexities in jets, but I think it opens up, kind of a whole phase space of other questions that we can ask otherwise. So I think, yeah, they're in my mind at least, they are, yeah, very much complementary programs, and okay, and then you can even go even further, right? There's also these kind of semi-inclusive measurements, right, where you trigger on a hadron and use this as a handle to then try and get a better sense of your jet population and better describe your background, for example. So yeah, I think they both have their utility, and yeah, that's not to say that experimentally we should stop measuring inclusive hadrons just for jets, but yeah, rather take advantage of both.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the detailed answer. Yeah. Are there any other questions maybe from UCT or looks like no? Okay. Okay, cool. Then I guess we can we should thank Raymond again. I'll clap. I don't know if you can hear it.
I can. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.